Have you ever felt the sharp sting of mockery cutting deeper than any blade? The story I'm about to share explores the crushing weight of public ridicule, but carries within it a profound message about the power of authenticity to pierce through the hardest hearts. When we stand in our truth, even with trembling legs, we sometimes unleash a force powerful enough to transform not just ourselves, but everyone around us. Wrinkled hands trembled on a worn Bible. Whispers echoed behind her. Agnes Thorne sat alone in the third pew, her weathered face a map of 87 years of joys and sorrows. The mid-morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colourful shadows across the wooden pews of St. Matthew's Chapel. She could hear them. The whispers, the muffled laughter, the judgment wrapped in pious smiles. She'd been coming to this church for 3 weeks now, and each Sunday the reception grew colder. "She smells like mothballs and sadness," whispered Olivia Jenkins, the pastor's 26-year-old daughter, leaning toward her friends in the row behind Agnes. The 4 young women, all in their 20s, all impeccably dressed in their Sunday best, tittered behind manicured hands. "My father says she just showed up one day, claiming to have some connection to the church from way back when. Probably just another lonely old woman looking for attention." Olivia didn't bother lowering her voice. She knew her position as Pastor Jenkins' daughter afforded her certain privileges, including the unspoken permission to establish the social hierarchy of St. Matthew's. Her 3 friends, Rebecca, Claire, and Danielle, followed her lead without question. They were the face of the church's youth program, featured prominently on the website and brochures. Young, beautiful, and full of the kind of confidence that had never been truly tested. Agnes adjusted her black headscarf, a relic from another era. Beneath it, wisps of silver-white hair escaped, framing a face etched by time. Her cardigan, grey and worn at the elbows, had seen better days, much like its owner. But her eyes, deep set and the color of faded denim, held a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her frail frame. "I heard she lives in that decrepit house at the edge of town," said Rebecca, tossing her chestnut hair over one shoulder. "You know, the one everyone says is haunted." "My mother says she's probably not right in the head," added Claire, the quietest of the 4, though no less cruel in her assessment. "Who wears those old-fashioned clothes anymore? It's like she stepped out of a history book." Agnes pretended not to hear, but each word landed like a small stone against her back. She clutched her Bible tighter, the leather cover smooth from decades of handling. Inside, pressed between the pages of Psalms, was a dried forget-me-not, tiny blue petals preserved in time, a memory sealed away. Pastor Thomas Jenkins took the pulpit, his voice booming through the speakers. At 49, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a head of salt and pepper hair that added to his authoritative presence. His sermons were dynamic, his delivery polished. Under his 12-year leadership, St. Matthew's had transformed from a struggling parish to the largest congregation in Mapleton. The new building, with its modern amenities and coffee shop in the lobby, stood as testament to his success. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "today we continue our series on living authentically in Christ. Let us turn to 2 Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 12. Agnes turned the pages of her Bible with practiced fingers. The binding was coming loose in places, held together with clear tape that had yellowed with age. The margins were filled with tiny, meticulous notes in faded ink, a lifetime of reflections and questions. Behind her, Olivia whispered again, loud enough for Agnes to hear. "Look at her ancient Bible. I bet she can't even afford a new one. Probably doesn't know how to use the Bible app either." More laughter. Agnes kept her eyes forward, though her shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing against a cold wind. The pastor's words about authenticity washed over her, a stark contrast to the performance she witnessed every Sunday since her return to Mapleton. After the service, congregants gathered in the lobby, clustering in familiar groups around high-top tables, paper coffee cups in hand. Agnes stood alone by the bulletin board, studying announcements she had already read twice before. No one approached her, no one offered the handshake or hug that others exchanged so freely. She was a ghost, visible but not quite real to the vibrant life of St. Matthew's. "Excuse me," a young man's voice broke through her isolation. Agnes turned to find Michael Hartwell, the church's 33-year-old music director, standing beside her. His kind eyes were the same warm brown as his skin, and unlike the others, his smile reached them. "I don't believe we've formally met. I'm Michael." "Agnes Thorne," she replied, her voice surprisingly strong despite her fragile appearance. She extended a hand that bore the marks of arthritis. Michael shook it gently. "I noticed you know all the hymns by heart. You don't even look at the screen." A small smile touched Agnes's lips. "I've had many years to learn them, young man." "Well, we could use more voices who know the old hymns. The choir practices on Wednesday evenings, if you're interested." Before Agnes could respond, Olivia appeared, slipping her arm through Michael's with practiced ease. "Michael, Dad wants to talk to you about next week's worship set." Her eyes flicked dismissively over Agnes. "Sorry to interrupt your charity work." Michael frowned. "Olivia, I was just introducing myself to Miss Thorne." "Mrs." Agnes corrected quietly. "Mrs. Thorne." "Of course." Michael nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Thorne, it was a pleasure. I hope to see you Wednesday." As Michael walked away, Olivia lingered, her perfect smile cooling several degrees. "You know, we have a senior ministry that meets on Tuesday mornings. People more your speed. They do crafts and play bingo." The condescension in her voice was thinly veiled. "Thank you, but I didn't come back to Mapleton to play bingo," Agnes replied, her gaze steady. Something in Agnes's eyes made Olivia take a small step back. "Came back? You lived here before?" "A lifetime ago." Agnes turned away, ending the conversation, as she made her way slowly toward the exit, leaning slightly on a worn wooden cane. Olivia watched her go, a flicker of curiosity momentarily replacing her disdain. There was something about the old woman, something in her eyes that didn't match her frail exterior, something that made Olivia suddenly, inexplicably uneasy. 3 more Sundays passed, and Agnes became a fixture at St. Matthew's, always alone, always in the third pew, always in her dark clothes and headscarf. The whispers continued, but she weathered them like one accustomed to storms. On Wednesday evenings, she appeared at choir practice, sitting quietly in the back row of altos. Her voice, when she finally sang, surprised everyone, clear and true, with the kind of richness that comes only from a life fully lived. Michael welcomed her warmly, but the others kept their distance, unsure what to make of this strange addition to their polished ensemble. It was after one such practice that Pastor Jenkins found Agnes sitting alone in the sanctuary, her Bible open on her lap, the stained glass windows now dark with night. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space, "we're locking up soon." Agnes looked up, studying him with those unsettling blue eyes. "Do you know why this church was built, Pastor Jenkins?" The question caught him off guard. Well, of course, St. Matthew's was founded in 1887. The original building burned down in 1967, and the congregation rebuilt. We completed this new facility 7 years ago. "That's the history," Agnes said softly, "but not the why." Pastor Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. Something about this woman made him feel like a student, unprepared for an examination. "Perhaps you could enlighten me, Mrs. Thorne, since you seem to know something I don't." Agnes closed her Bible, her fingers lingering on the worn cover. "Not tonight, Pastor, but soon." She rose slowly, gathering her things. "Your daughter and her friends, they have good voices, but they don't feel the hymns. Music isn't just notes, you know. It's the breath of the soul." She moved past him, leaving the pastor staring after her, an inexplicable chill settling between his shoulder blades. The following Sunday, Pastor Jenkins made an announcement that sent a ripple of tension through the congregation. "As many of you know, our building fund has hit a roadblock. We're still $100,000 short of what we need to break ground on the new youth center. He paused, scanning the faces before him. I've been praying about this, seeking guidance, and I believe God is calling us to a season of testimony. Over the next few weeks, I'll be asking members of our congregation to share how God has worked in their lives, specifically through their giving and receiving. Agnes sat straighter in her pew, something flickering across her features. Anticipation, perhaps, or resolve. Behind her, Olivia leaned forward to whisper to her friends. Dad's desperate. The board is breathing down his neck about that youth center. He promised it would be built by Christmas. Should we volunteer to share our testimonies? Asked Danielle. We could talk about the mission trip to Guatemala. Olivia nodded. Perfect. We'll sign up right after service. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to disperse, a small crowd gathered around the pastor at the front. Olivia and her friends moved purposefully toward her father, but as they approached, they were shocked to see Agnes already there, her name being written on the pastor's list. You? Olivia blurted, unable to contain her surprise. You're giving a testimony. Agnes turned, her expression serene. Yes, dear. I believe I have something to share. Pastor Jenkins looked uncomfortable but nodded. Mrs. Thorne will be speaking next Sunday. He glanced at his daughter. Did you want to sign up as well, Olivia? We'll take the Sunday after, Olivia replied, her eyes never leaving Agnes. I wouldn't want to miss Mrs. Thorne's contribution. The word dripped with sarcasm, but Agnes merely smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and walked away, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the polished floor. The week that followed was filled with speculation. Who was this strange old woman, and what could she possibly have to say that would interest anyone? The rumors grew wilder with each telling. She was a homeless woman seeking shelter. She was a rich eccentric testing the church's charity. She was mentally ill and fixated on the church for unknown reasons. Through it all, Agnes continued her quiet routine. Sunday service, Wednesday choir practice, and occasional solitary visits to the sanctuary when the building was mostly empty. She carried with her a small leather-bound journal that she wrote in frequently, its pages as worn as her Bible. Michael was the only one who made any real effort to know her. After choir practice, he would sometimes sit with her, asking about the old hymns and their histories. Agnes would come alive during these conversations, her eyes bright with memory as she shared stories of hymns sung during wars and depressions, in times of great sorrow and tremendous joy. You know so much about this church's history, Michael remarked one evening. It's like you were there for all of it. Agnes smiled enigmatically. Not all, but enough. She patted his hand. You have a gift, Michael, not just for music, but for seeing people, really seeing them. Not everyone has been as welcoming as they should be, he said carefully. People fear what they don't understand, Agnes replied, and often what they fear most is a mirror. The conversation left Michael puzzled, but he had little time to dwell on it. The church was buzzing with activity as Sunday approached. The building fund campaign had stalled completely, and the board was pressing Pastor Jenkins for solutions. The testimony series was his last, desperate attempt to reignite giving before the construction deadline passed and they lost their permits. Sunday dawned bright and clear, the kind of autumn day that painted the world in gold and crimson. The church was unusually full. Word had spread about the mysterious old woman who would be speaking, drawing the curious and the skeptical alike. Agnes arrived earlier than usual, dressed as always in her modest dark clothes and headscarf, but there was something different about her today, a straightness to her spine, a clarity in her gaze that commanded attention despite her unassuming appearance. She took her place in the third pew, placing both her Bible and the leather journal on the seat beside her. As the sanctuary filled, the whispers and stares intensified. Olivia and her friends entered, dressed impeccably as always, their faces alight with anticipation for what they assumed would be an entertaining disaster. I can't believe Dad is actually letting her speak, Olivia said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. She'll probably ramble about her cats or something. Maybe she'll pass out collection baskets for herself, Rebecca suggested, prompting stifled laughter from the others. In the center of the church, an elderly woman sat ramrod straight, her wrinkled face set in stark determination. The black headscarf covered most of her silver-white hair, while her weathered hands clutched a worn Bible in her lap. Behind her, 4 young women in their 20s sat together, their faces alight with barely contained laughter. The contrast was striking: youth and age, beauty and weathering, mockery and dignity, all framed by the solemn wooden pews and stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Chapel. The service proceeded as usual, worship led by Michael and the choir, announcements, scripture reading. Agnes sang each hymn from memory, her voice rising clear and strong among the congregation. Then Pastor Jenkins took the pulpit, his expression a careful mask of pastoral enthusiasm. "Today we begin our series on testimony," he announced. "As Christians, we are called to witness to God's work in our lives. Today we'll hear from Mrs. Agnes Thorne, who has recently joined our congregation." A murmur rippled through the church as Agnes rose slowly and made her way to the front, her cane tapping against the carpet. She carried her Bible and journal with her. As she turned to face the congregation, a shaft of colored light from the stained glass fell across her face, illuminating eyes that suddenly seemed younger than her years. Before she could speak, a snicker erupted from Olivia's row, followed by poorly concealed laughter. Someone whispered, "Did she escape from a convent?" Another voice, "This should be good." Agnes stood silently, watching as the laughter spread like ripples in a pond. Pastor Jenkins cleared his throat uncomfortably, but made no move to intervene. When Agnes finally spoke, her voice silenced the room. "I was 17 when I first fell in love," she began, her tone clear and unwavering. "Not with a boy, though there would be time for that later. No, I fell in love with God in a way that consumed me completely." The unexpected opening caught everyone's attention. This was not the rambling of a confused elderly woman. It was 1954, and the world was changing rapidly. My father was the wealthiest man in Mapleton, Thomas Blackwood. Some of you might recognize that name. Another murmur passed through the congregation. The Blackwood family was legendary in Mapleton, though they had disappeared from the town decades ago. Their former estate, now subdivided and developed, still contained some of the most prestigious addresses in the area. I had everything a young woman could want: wealth, beauty, suitors, education. But I also had questions that no one could answer. Why was I born into privilege while others suffered? What purpose did my life serve? These questions led me here, to this very spot, though the building was much different then. Agnes opened her journal and began to read. April 7th, 1954. Today I sat in the back pew of St. Matthew's and watched as Mrs. Ellis and her 3 children were turned away at the door. Pastor Williams said there was no room, but I counted 17 empty seats. Mrs. Ellis is colored, and her husband was killed in Korea last year. The church board doesn't want their kind attending services. I've never felt such shame as I did watching those children walk away, confused and hurt. Is this what Christ would do? Is this what I should accept? Agnes looked up, her eyes scanning the now silent congregation. I was raised to be a proper young lady, to accept the world as it was and take my place in it without question. But that day changed me. I began to use my father's money and influence secretly, funding a small mission on the other side of town where all were welcome, regardless of color or status. She turned a page in her journal. June 12, 1954. Father would disown me if he knew what I was doing. The mission now feeds 27 families weekly and holds services twice on Sundays. Pastor Williams from St. Matthew's has threatened to have it shut down as a public nuisance. I've used my trust fund to secure the property for 3 more years. It may be all the money I have access to until I'm 21, but I've never felt richer. Behind Agnes, Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This was not the testimony she had expected. Around her, the congregation sat transfixed, hanging on every word from this woman they had so casually dismissed. Agnes continued, recounting her growing involvement with the mission, her secret defiance of her family, and the town's social order. Her voice remained steady as she described falling in love with a young doctor who worked at the mission, a man named Edward Thorne. Brilliant, compassionate, and deemed entirely unsuitable by her family because of his modest background and progressive views. When my father discovered my activities and my relationship with Edward, he gave me an ultimatum: renounce both or be disowned. I was 20 years old when I walked away from the Blackwood fortune. A collective gasp rippled through the sanctuary. Agnes's eyes found Olivia's for a brief moment before continuing. Edward and I married a month later. We devoted our lives to the mission work, living in 2 small rooms above the sanctuary. He treated anyone who came through our doors, regardless of their ability to pay. I taught children whose schools were overcrowded or unwelcoming. We were poor in possessions, but rich in purpose. She paused, turning to another page in her journal. March 3rd, 1967. Tragedy beyond words. The fire spread so quickly. Edward ran back inside to save the Williams children who were trapped in the Sunday school room. He got them out, but the roof collapsed before he could escape. My Edward is gone, and with him, my heart. But his sacrifice saved 7 young lives. The congregation from St. Matthew's watched from across the street as our little mission burned. Not one of them offered help, not even Pastor Williams, who stood in his fine coat and watched as my world turned to ash. Agnes's voice faltered for the first time. The sanctuary was utterly silent now, the earlier mockery forgotten as her story unfolded. The mission was gone. My husband was gone. And St. Matthew's, the church that had rejected so many, continued on as if nothing had happened. I left Mapleton with nothing but grief and this journal. She closed the small book and looked up, her gaze sweeping across the congregation. I spent the next 57 years serving in missions around the world, Africa, South America, Asia. Everywhere I went, I carried the lesson I learned here, that the truest witness of faith is not in words, but in action. Not in judgment, but in mercy. Agnes opened her Bible, removing the pressed forget-me-not that had been hidden between its pages. She held it up for all to see, a tiny blue flower, its color still visible despite the decades. Edward picked this for me the day he proposed. He said forget-me-nots were perfect for us because they thrive in difficult conditions and return year after year, even when you think they're gone forever. She carefully replaced the flower in her Bible. Like truth, like love, like faith that matters. She turned toward Pastor Jenkins, who stood frozen beside the pulpit. You asked why this church was built, Pastor. The answer is in your archives, if anyone had bothered to look. After the mission burned down, there was an insurance settlement. Edward had taken out a policy and named St. Matthew's as the beneficiary, with one condition: that they use the money to rebuild and open their doors to everyone. Another shockwave passed through the congregation. Agnes continued relentlessly. St. Matthew's took the money, enough to rebuild after their own fire in 1967. They took Edward's sacrifice and used it to save themselves, but they didn't honor his condition. Not really. They built bigger and better, but the heart remained small. She gestured around the sanctuary with a frail hand. This new building, this expansion you're so desperate to fund, what is it for? More comfortable seats? Better coffee? A bigger stage? Or is it to truly serve those who need it most? For the first time, Agnes's voice broke with emotion. I came back to Mapleton one last time because I'm dying. Cancer. The doctors give me 3 months at most. I wanted to see what had become of the place where I lost everything, but found my purpose. I wanted to know if Edward's sacrifice had meant anything in the end. A sob broke the silence, not from Agnes, but from Olivia, who sat with tears streaming down her face. Beside her, her friends looked stricken, their earlier mockery now a source of profound shame. Agnes reached into her worn handbag and withdrew an envelope, which she handed to the pastor. Inside is a check for $100,000, the exact amount you need for your building fund. It's everything I have left from a lifetime of simple living and careful saving, my final worldly possession. Pastor Jenkins opened the envelope with trembling hands, staring at the check in disbelief. "But," Agnes continued, her voice now gentle but firm, "it comes with the same condition Edward's gift did. Open your doors, truly open them. Not just to those who look right or speak right or live right by your standards. See the humanity in everyone who seeks shelter here. The money is yours, if you can stand before God and this congregation and promise that." She turned back to face the people of St. Matthew's, many of whom were now in tears. "I don't share this testimony to shame you, though shame has its place in transformation. I share it because the past doesn't have to dictate the future. You can choose today to be the church that Edward and I believed was possible, one where love overcomes judgment, where service trumps status, where the broken are made whole, not by being fixed, but by being fully embraced in their brokenness." Agnes made her way slowly back to her pew, the tap of her cane the only sound in the stunned sanctuary. Pastor Jenkins remained at the pulpit, the check still in his hand, visibly struggling to compose himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I don't know what to say except, "Thank you, Mrs. Thorne, and I'm sorry, deeply sorry." He stepped away from the pulpit and did something unprecedented in his 12 years at St. Matthew's. He walked down to the congregation, stopping at Agnes's pew. There, in front of everyone, Pastor Thomas Jenkins knelt. "On behalf of this church, past and present, I ask for your forgiveness. And I make you this promise. Your gift will not be wasted. Your husband's sacrifice will not be forgotten again." A moment of profound silence filled the sanctuary. Then, from the back of the church, Michael began to sing softly without accompaniment. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." One by one, voices joined his. First the choir, then the congregation, until the entire church was filled with the ancient hymn of redemption. Agnes sat with her eyes closed, tears tracking silently down her weathered cheeks. When the final notes faded, Olivia rose from her seat and walked slowly to where Agnes sat. The young woman's perfect makeup was streaked with tears, her confident demeanor replaced by genuine humility. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice breaking, "I've been so cruel to you. We all have. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I ask for it anyway." Agnes looked up at the beautiful young woman before her, seeing past the carefully constructed facade to the uncertain heart beneath. "Olivia," she said gently, "forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you accept and then pay forward." She reached out a gnarled hand, which Olivia took between her own smooth ones. "Will you help me back to the house at the edge of town? It's getting harder for me to make the walk alone." "Every day, if you'll let me," Olivia whispered. "And would you tell me more about Edward? About the mission? About everything?" Agnes smiled, a true smile that transformed her face, revealing glimpses of the 17-year-old girl who had first fallen in love with a God big enough to upend her world. "I would like that very much." In the months that followed, St. Matthew's Chapel underwent a transformation more significant than any construction project could have achieved. Pastor Jenkins, profoundly affected by Agnes's testimony, led his congregation in a journey of self-examination and renewed purpose. The building fund was redirected. Instead of a state-of-the-art youth center, the church established a free medical clinic on the property, named in honor of Dr. Edward Thorne. They partnered with the community center across town to offer after-school programs for children from Mapleton's most underserved neighborhoods. Olivia spent every afternoon with Agnes, recording her stories and insights, learning from a life so different from her own. Her friends joined her, at first awkwardly, then with growing genuineness, as they discovered in Agnes not a pitiful old woman, but a soul of tremendous courage and wisdom. Agnes Thorne lived not 3 months, but 7. long enough to see the first patients treated at the Thorn Clinic, long enough to witness St. Matthew's become the church she and Edward had always envisioned. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep, the church held a service that brought together people from every corner of Mapleton, rich and poor, young and old, from all backgrounds and walks of life. Michael led the music that day, with Olivia and the choir singing hymns that Agnes had taught them, songs of struggle and hope, of faith tested and renewed. Pastor Jenkins spoke not of a woman who had joined their congregation briefly at the end of her life, but of a prophet who had returned to call them back to their true purpose. In the third pew, where Agnes had always sat, they placed a small vase of forget-me-nots and a plaque with words taken from her journal. Faith without action is an empty shell. Love without sacrifice is merely sentiment, but a life lived in service to both. That is a testimony that outlasts death itself. And in the archives of St. Matthew's Chapel, beside the official church history, now sits a leather-bound journal, Agnes's gift to the future, a reminder that the most powerful testimonies often come from the most unexpected voices, and that true transformation begins when we have the courage to really listen.